I'm Thalie Martini, CEO of Breast Cancer UK, and welcome to the Be Well podcast. Today, I'm excited to be speaking to a renowned environmental health scientist who specialises in how exposures to chemicals and chemical mixtures, especially during early life, can predispose people to disease later in life. Now, she is Acting Vice Chancellor for Research and Engagement and Professor of Environmental Health Sciences at the University of Massachusetts. And in 2023, we at Breast Cancer UK were really privileged to have her as our keynote speaker for our very first breast cancer prevention conference. Now, what makes this guest so special is that she is one of the leading experts in, frankly, what is actually a very niche but much needed field of research. Now, to the listeners who follow Breast Cancer UK, what you'll know about us is that we are passionate about and dedicated to funding research that helps us understand the impacts of chemical exposures on breast cancer risk, as well as our general health. So it really is a privilege to be able to talk to a scientist who has devoted her life and career to this. I can't wait to get into this conversation and to dig into the science behind it all with her. I'm honoured to welcome Dr. Laura Vandenberg. Welcome, Laura. So pleased to see you again.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, let's start talking about your work. And that's really fascinating for us because I mentioned it's an area that we're very keen on. But specifically, your work looks at how exposures to low doses of potentially toxic chemicals during early life and how they can impact, for example, have subtle but significant changes on what happens to people in later life. So, for example, exposures in the womb. Now, your focus is really quite specific on the impacts of very specific substances known as endocrine disrupting chemicals, otherwise known as EDCs. So the very first question to ask is one that we get an awful lot of, and it's quite complicated, but maybe you can put it in simple terms for us, and that is quite simply, what are EDCs?
Sure, that's a great place to start. So I think it's actually easier to back up even a little bit and talk about hormones first. So a lot of us think about hormones really as it relates to adolescence because, of course, we talk about, our teenagers sort of going bonkers because of their hormones. And we sometimes think about hormones related to sex and reproduction, or even now, more recently, people think about thyroid hormone and how important it is for the maintenance of body weight. But hormones really are responsible for pretty much everything our bodies do, from before we're born all the way through death. So you can't digest food if you don't have a proper functioning hormone system. And you can't regulate your blood pressure, which means you won't be able to sit up if you don't have a functioning hormone system. You also would not have a functioning brain or functioning reproductive tract if you don't have properly working hormones in your body. So they're really critical for our health and really also our development. So when we think about endocrine disrupting chemicals, or EDCs, we're talking about chemicals that can impact that exquisitely sensitive signaling that's happening in our bodies really throughout our entire lives. Some of these EDCs work by mimicking hormones that our bodies make naturally. And that might not seem like a big deal, right? If you're already making some, what's a little bit more? But it can be important because you could be making them you could be exposing yourself to them during a time when you shouldn't be making them, when you shouldn't be exposed to them. You also, some EDCs can block the actions of hormones, so they can prevent the ability of hormones from having their normal properties, their normal actions, which can disrupt development or also contribute to diseases. And as you said, these endocrine disrupting chemicals, and I know we're going to get into this a little bit over the time we have together, but the issue is that they're not toxic the way we think about poison, right? If we think about something that's poisonous, we think, oh my goodness, if I fall into a vat of that, or if I drink a little bit of it, I'm going to die. And for the most part, that's not the case for these endocrine disruptors. Instead, they're actually more insidious. They're sort of wearing away at us a little bit at a time. And I like to think about it as sort of what happens if I get on a boat that's leaving Boston and I'm trying to get to London, but I'm off by 3 or 4 degrees. Doesn't seem like a big deal, right? Except that where I land, I'm speaking French instead of English, and that's kind of a big deal. So endocrine disruptors shift things. They modify things in ways that can increase risk of disease. In some cases, they can induce disease directly, but not by poisoning us, by changing the way that those hormones are acting in our body.
As you say, that really sounds a lot more insidious. I love the way you explain it, because that's half the issue we have, is being able to explain what EDCs are in ways that people can really understand why we should be concerned about it. Now, another thing that's interesting about your work is looking at most studies in this area, they tend to focus on how exposure to toxic chemicals during pregnancies might actually impact on that stage in their life. So birth defects, for example. But your work looks beyond that. It examines how EDC exposures during pregnancy, also lactation, how they can affect both the offspring and the mother. So if you can tell us a bit about why this is equally important to focus on, and why we should be looking both at early life effect on how exposure to EDCs can actually predispose us to disease in later life.
Sure. There's a biological answer that I'll come to in a second, but there's also the sociological answer, which is that fully grown women are people. And so we should care about what's happening to women during adulthood, during pregnancy, during the period where they're trying to conceive, during lactation. And so historically, yes, people in my field have really focused on exposures that happen during early development and how it might lead to diseases. And that's critically important. I'm trained as a developmental biologist. I'm super interested in those as fundamental questions, and also from the public health perspective. But from the human perspective, we continually treat women like vessels that are not important or critical. And we do it in medicine, we do it in sort of society. And I think that that's just, it gives me the ick. So, from a social perspective, we should care what happens to women and their bodies. And if an exposure that you're encountering during pregnancy or leading up to pregnancy or when you're nursing is increasing your risk of disease, that's super critical, as is, what's happening to the baby. Um, from a science perspective, from a biology perspective, some of the earliest work in this field comes from a really sad example of a pharmaceutical that was prescribed to pregnant women under the mistaken notion that if some estrogen during pregnancy is good for you, then more must be better. And this drug, diethylstilbestrol, was administered to tens of millions of women who were at risk of miscarriage, but also it was considered routine prophylaxis, like taking a vitamin. And so these millions of women were exposed to DES during pregnancy on purpose as a drug. And then it wasn't until decades later that their daughters started to be diagnosed with really serious conditions. So a rare cancer of the vagina, an increased risk of having ectopic pregnancy, difficulties even getting pregnant, malformations of the internal reproductive tract. And then, of course, when those daughters reached the age where breast cancer is common, they were found to have an increased risk of breast cancer. That got a lot of attention.
Wow.
And that DES story, the DES daughters, the ones who were exposed as fetuses, have had many, many, many studies done on them. But what few people, even in my field, realize is that the mothers also had an increased risk of breast cancer.
Yeah.
And we've done very little study on the mothers, but that really was one of the reasons why I became super interested in if you're going to expose, in my case, I study rodents. If I'm going to expose a rodent to something, I should be looking at the offspring, of course, because they're hypersensitive if exposed during early development. But the mom is also affected if she's exposed during pregnancy.
Well, actually, talk to us a bit about some of your work, because what you do is you look at the EDC effects on mammary glands and their development. And can you tell us why that's significant and what it is that it can tell us about EDC exposures?
Yeah, so the rodent, both the mouse and the rat mammary gland, are incredibly similar to the human breast, and the same function, same cells, largely driven in the same way by hormones, develops under a very similar process and procedures. And so it gives us a really nice model to be able to understand how environmental chemicals or agents or radiation or carcinogens can affect breast cancer risk. I know a lot of people are not keen to do animal work and or not really a big fan of testing chemicals on animals, but the
Yeah, and
alternative
just for the
is
record, we are an animal-free charity, but we
yes,
also
yes.
we also appreciate that work happens in this area.
Yes,
Yeah.
so I think that whenever we can, we try to use cell-based models to evaluate chemicals, and certainly cell-based models are really good at telling us whether a chemical can alter DNA or can mimic an estrogen, but there is currently no good cell-based model for the mammary gland, the effects on the whole tissue. And the alternative is to allow these chemicals to be out in the environment and exposing you and me, and then we're the
Yeah,
test subjects
sure.
over a period of time. So the rodent allows us also to study the whole life cycle in just a period of a few months. So we can get answers that in humans, the story of DES, that's such a tragedy because there were tens of millions of women that were exposed, and it took decades to be able to determine that there was an effect. Versus in the rodent, that same information would have been discovered in a period of a year or less, and should have been discovered in a period of a year or less. So yes, my interest is when exposures occur during those vulnerable periods of development, how do those exposures affect the development of the breast tissue, the function, your ability to make milk, and then of course, as your interest is, the disease risk, and whether exposures to these chemicals in ways that are similar to human exposures increases that risk or can actually cause breast cancer itself.
And these chemicals you're talking about, are there specific chemicals that we should be most concerned about when we're talking? I know EDCs are a very complex group of chemicals, but are there specific ones that we are more likely to be exposed to, and where are we going to be exposed to them?
Sure. So I choose chemicals for a couple reasons. I generally focus on chemicals that have been shown to be estrogenic in those cell-based assays that people are widely exposed to. So, I don't really see the point in, as you say, we're trying to be ethical in our studies. I don't see the point in exposing animals to things that we're not worried that people will be exposed to. So I study chemicals that are found in plastics. So the bisphenols have gotten a lot of attention. In the time that I've been in this field, we went from people not knowing what BPA was to now everybody knows what it is, but they don't really understand what it is or why it's important. But it's estrogenic. And so bisphenols, BPA, BPS, and other similar bisphenols have gotten a lot of attention. I study chemicals that are found in personal care products. So that includes some phthalates. That's that weird word that starts with PH,
It's
but
weird.
no one can pronounce phthalates. And some parabens. And so a lot of cosmetics now are also labeled paraben free. But those are chemicals that are added to personal care products to provide them with properties. In the case of phthalates, it can help stabilize the chemical or to add fragrances to personal care products. Parabens are added because they're antimicrobial and can allow the shelf life of a product to be extended. So in many cases, these are chemicals that are added to convey very particular properties, but of course they have, along with that benefit from that property is this risk because they have these endocrine disrupting properties. I've also looked at some chemicals that are flame retardants, so they're added to furniture and to fabrics as a way to provide, protection against heat damage or to reduce the likelihood of fire in homes. The reality is most of them are not very good flame retardants, but they're added anyway. And I also look at chemicals that are UV stabilizers. So they're added to fabrics to make them brighter and to be less likely to fade in sunshine, but they're also added to plastics to prevent products from degrading because of sunshine or other UV exposures.
Wow. So there's a lot of chemicals, and they're just a few of the EDCs. And as you say, they are estrogenic, so they have some impact on circulating estrogen when we're exposed to them, which is why we're concerned about them. But then there's something even more complex that you look at, and we have this shared interest in this, and that's the idea around the chemical cocktails. Um, uh, can you explain to us what actually we mean when we talk about chemical cocktails? And why is it important to look at how EDCs interact with one another as opposed to individually?
Sure, yeah. So the reality is that, we spend a lot of attention and time focused on a chemical like BPA, which is critically important. You're exposed to it from plastics and can linings, and it's in our clothing now, and it contaminates water. But you're not just exposed to BPA. You're exposed also to phthalates and parabens and flame retardants and pesticides. And all of these chemicals in your body are acting as a mixture. It's not like BPA waits its turn until the phthalate has done its thing. They're in there. They're circulating in your body. And so there's been a big movement, both in laboratory studies, but also epidemiologists that study human populations, to try to look at chemicals in this cocktail, in this mixture. So, and ultimately, I hate to say it like this, but I'm going to be frank. I don't care about BPA. I care about estrogenic chemicals. And so, if there was something we could do to BPA to make it have all of its beautiful properties as a chemical, but not be estrogenic, I'm all for it. So, right, I don't have a discriminatory nature towards chemicals that have certain names, or right, it's about the estrogenicity. And so the science that's been done in the last 10 years or so has really moved towards helping us evaluate chemicals as mixtures. And part of that can be trying to figure out, okay, in my body, there's 100 different chemical exposures that all act as estrogens. Which ones are having the greatest impact on my health? And there's mathematical modeling and screening tests that can be done to try to narrow it down so that we focus on the worst actors. Then, of course, if you eliminate those worst actors, now a new bunch rise up to being the worst actors. So, we're kind of on a little chemical treadmill while we're also dealing with this chemical mixture. But we're trying to move science away from studying one chemical at a time, because there is no human on Earth who's exposed to one of these things at a time.
But interestingly, our regulatory system quite likes to look at them individually, don't they? And will
That is the
determine.
biggest frustration,
Yeah.
is even when we're thinking about bisphenols, just in the last few years in Europe, there's been a huge movement by regulatory agencies to stop using BPA in food contact materials. I think they're 20 years late, but we should celebrate that as a public health success story. The problem is that in those all that regulation around BPA, we're now replacing BPA with BPS, and it's also estrogenic, and it's also
Yeah.
having these same effects on the mammary gland. So yes, the regulatory system still has a lot of catching up to do. And that catching up is not just about studying mixtures, but also about studying the mammary gland at all. Because when we test chemicals for safety out in the world, the mammary gland is once again sort of given short shrift. It's poorly studied. In cases where regulatory agencies are requiring animal studies for chemicals, they often don't look at the mammary gland at all. Or when they look at it, they dismiss the findings. And this is incredibly frustrating to those of us in the field, because we know that these chemicals are affecting the mammary gland, and that is not driving public health protective actions.
Yeah. Well, actually, one of the reasons we're so focused on our research being dedicated to studying how EDCs impact on our breast cancer risk is that it's sadly so underfunded, and this area of research is really quite overlooked. So what do you think are the biggest challenges that we now face in making sure we can identify EDCs and their effects on our health and move forward really to gain a much better understanding so that policies can follow to protect us?
Yeah, so I think the biggest issues are actually political and not scientific.
Mm,
So, as an example, here in the U.S., we have defined our entire regulation around whether you can demonstrate that a chemical has an adverse
mm,
effect on an outcome. But adverse effect is defined as something happening in an animal. And so all of the cell-based assays that say this chemical is estrogenic, this chemical is estrogenic, this chemical is estrogenic, I as a researcher can tell you in some people during some vulnerable periods of life, that chemical is going to affect breast health. It is going to, because that's
mm,
what estrogens do. And yet that is not considered sufficient to regulate chemicals.
mm,
So to me, I think that our biggest hurdles that we need to overcome is being able to screen chemicals for whether or not they're estrogenic. We can do that very well, but use those data to actually make decisions and protect public health.
yeah.
I think that there's also mixed up in this argument that somehow we need all of these chemicals as a way to maintain economies, right? Like if we don't have this, we're not going to have plastics anymore. If we
Yeah.
don't have this, we're not going to have personal care products anymore. Or these products will be less safe without these chemicals in them. There's two arguments to that. One is our economy that's based on producing stuff that hurts us actually hurts the economy because people miss work when they're sick.
Mm,
People, have to care for their loved ones when they're sick. And here in the U.S., we pay for our health care. So the cost of paying for breast cancer treatments and other kinds of diseases, we're focused today on breast cancer, but there's a lot
mm,
of diseases connected to exposures to these chemicals. This is harming our economy. And so if all we care about is the economy, then arguing that we need to keep producing these chemicals for an economic reason it's just bollocks. It is. It does not hold water. The idea that also we have to have these chemicals in our products in order for us to have safe plastics or
mm,
safe personal care products is also just not true. And there's a lot of evidence that we can replace these chemicals or stop using them entirely, and it doesn't affect the quality of the product itself. So I think that we need to push for innovation, and that innovation needs to be, I want to have a mascara that I can use for 6 months that will not give me an eye disease or some sort of infection of the eye, but I don't want it to have this list of estrogenic chemicals in
mm,
it or any other new replacements that you come up with. And I really believe that we have really smart people on this planet that can solve that problem.
mm,
And we need to make them solve that problem by saying, either from a regulatory perspective, no to this list of chemicals, or from a consumer perspective, no to this list of chemicals. And unfortunately, we've had a lot more success with consumer action
yeah.
saying no more estrogenic things in my baby bottles, no more estrogenic things in infant formula. And we need to take that to the next step. No more estrogenic things in can linings, in plastics, in clothing apparel, in all of these things that we interact with every day. No more estrogenic chemicals.
Mm. Yeah, and we have a slightly different regulatory system here in Europe in that a lot more chemicals are regulated. But as you are probably aware, the European system is now different to the UK system following Brexit. And so one of the issues I think that really remains for us is this idea that, okay, we can approach managing exposures through, say, chemical regulation. But also, it's really important to provide that health advice. And we're one of the only charities in the UK that provides health advice around how to reduce exposures. And really the argument that other health organizations might use is that the evidence just isn't strong enough for us to suggest that people need to take precautions. We're arguing, on the contrary, that the precautionary principle is the best approach we have. So what do you say about that? And what do you think? What do you think the problem is with those the health authorities themselves who are not making that link?
Well, I think that the evidence is strong enough for a lot of these chemicals, and that there's a concept in regulatory toxicology called read across, which says if you learn a thing about this chemical, you can apply knowledge to these related chemicals until you have evidence to overturn that belief, right? So we don't need to study the 50 BPA replacement chemicals in the same depth that we studied BPA. If they have similar chemical structures, we should assume that they act like BPA. So I guess there's a little precaution in there, but it's scientific focused precaution. I also think that the precautionary principle sometimes gets a bad rap because it makes it seem like we're walking around afraid of things, and that's not it. The point is, there's this maxim, look before you leap, right? You would never say to someone like, oh, you're afraid of the world because you're not going to just jump into a pond that you can't see the bottom of. No, the whole idea of the precautionary principle when it comes to chemical safety is when you know enough to be worried about it, and not when you know nothing. Although I also think we shouldn't be exposed to chemicals we know nothing about. There's a different problem there. But again, from the precautionary perspective, we know enough to be worried. So it's not really precaution anymore. It's now, again, as I say, it's not a scientific discussion. It's a values-based discussion. So what do we value? Do we value protecting people's health, or do we value a continued influence on an economy that ultimately we're paying for it again because it's influencing people's health?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So avoiding exposures, that's an interesting question. And I will go out and do talks, and often people walk away thinking, look, I love what you're saying, but it's really complicated. How do we navigate the product labels? The product labels have been designed to just stump us. They're either too vague or there's too many ingredients. And so a lot of people feel that it's, they need a scientific degree to get through it. So what's a way for consumers to have easy ideas around how to avoid exposures? Are there things that people can do when they're looking for a particular product that doesn't involve them really being familiar with all of these chemicals?
Yes, I want to echo what you said because I do this for a living and I can't navigate the purchasing. And so I don't think that we should make people feel like it's their own burden to try to, become a chemist or read every label. I mean, who has time for that in the grocery store to read every label? So I think there are a few pretty simple things that we can do, and recognizing that these won't fit everybody's life, that, whether because of cost or because of time and convenience. So we make the best choices for ourselves and for our families, and then we need to push decision makers, regulators to really protect us on the big picture. So on the what can I do, I avoid plastics whenever I can. I pack my lunch for work and I pack it in glass containers. So that's a really simple thing. If you have to use plastic because of weight or, I don't know, people sometimes get fears about them breaking, but I've used them for 15 years and I've never broken one. So I'm clumsy, so I'm not super careful. These are durable materials. But if that feels like it doesn't work for you, make sure you take it out of the plastic when you're going to microwave it. When something is labeled microwave safe, that means it's safe for the plastic, not safe for the person. So, get it out of
We
that
haven't thought
plastic.
about you. We just don't want you to complain about the product, yeah.
Right, exactly. Yes. In trying to reduce the number of fragrances that you use in your house, as an example. So those fragrances are just chemicals that are added for pleasantry, but they're not necessary for the function of your laundry detergent or your soaps. I don't wear makeup, but that's because I'm lazy. There are lots of makeup brands that are really trying to focus on reducing parabens and phthalates and providing shelf stability in other ways, or selling smaller volumes and quantities, so that you're not, maybe we're not supposed to use a mascara for a year. Maybe we're only supposed to use it for 2 months if you're an everyday user. So, cleaning your house, using a simple wet mop, and trying to get dust up out of your house is really an easy way to reduce exposures, especially if you have young children, because children eat a lot of dust. And every time I say that, I know your face is like, oh, disgusting, but
Oh,
they do. Children eat
yeah.
a lot of dirt and dust because they spend a lot more time on the floor. And so, again, a simple wet mop is sufficient in order to reduce the vast majority of dust inside our houses, which contributes to exposures. And that dust is coming from, it's not just our skin, which is gross, but really every time you sit on a sofa and you have that like swoosh feeling of sitting on foam, you're releasing some parts of that foam, which is flame retardants. So, regularly vacuuming your house and mopping your house can reduce your exposures through those routes by a big deal. And then being thoughtful about what you spray in your own garden and yard. So I live in an area that we have a ton of poison ivy. And as much as I can, I'm using vinegar to tackle vinegar and dish soap and salt to tackle the poison ivy. Other than that, I let the weeds grow. They're pretty, and I don't have time to deal with them anyway. So,
Yeah.
when you can buy organic produce, but there are lots of organizations that make recommendations about, buying organic berries is going to give you a bigger bang for your buck because
Yeah.
you don't peel it, right?
No,
Than something that you
absolutely.
peel like an orange.
Yeah, we do that on our website actually. We look at all of the, if you can't buy organic, narrow it down to these few items that are most likely to be full of pesticides. Yeah.
I think that's so critical because even organic produce is made with chemicals.
Mm.
This is again when we're not trying to make people chemical phobic.
Mm.
Chemicals have lots of great properties and we
Mm.
use them for reasons. But moving towards organic produce also is a way to support often smaller farms, local farms that are thinking differently
Yeah.
about food production. And similarly, if you can buy fresh, buy it. If you can't buy fresh, buy frozen. If you can't buy frozen, buy canned. And so, right, we want people to have a well-rounded diet. We don't want to discourage people from eating fruits and vegetables in whatever form you can get them. But the more you eat fresh and the more you can get that fresh from, I drive past 3 farm stands on my way home when it's not snowing out, which it is right now. I try to buy from local farmers when I
Yeah.
can because then I feel like I'm connecting to the food that's in my
Mm.
area. I recognize that's not available to everyone. People who
Mm.
live in cities maybe don't have that option. And so, again, if you can buy fresh, buy fresh. If you can't, buy frozen. If you can't, buy frozen. And don't do that microwaving in the bag frozen thing,
Oh,
right? Don't. All
no.
these vegetables that are now sold as, oh, it's so easy, just pop it right in the microwave with the bag. Don't microwave it in the bag. Take it out of the bag, put it in something that's ceramic or glass.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And thank you so much for sharing with us what is really quite a complex area of science, but demystifying it for us, because it really is something that a lot of people have an interest in but struggle to get their head around. So that's been absolutely fascinating. I do have a question for you, which isn't really science related. It's one that we like to ask all our guests, and that's, you talked about how you like to buy your produce from the growers themselves, and you've got loads of great ways to look after yourself. But do you have a guilty pleasure?
A guilty pleasure. Netflix, chocolate.
Chocolate seems to always be there. Very few of us can avoid it.
Yes, well, and again, if you can get away from mass-produced chocolate to getting to like, your local candy shop, it's more
Mm,
expensive, but my goodness, can you really treat yourself?
yeah.
So, yes, but in terms of like truly guilty pleasures, I think that to have the knowledge that I have, sometimes people think, oh, it must be exhausting to walk through life thinking about all the ways that the world around you is poisoning you. And I don't, I promise you. It's
Mm,
that's not a fun way to be either. You can't show up to
no.
people's house and tell them like, "Why are you using that? Please remove that." No. So, we're all trying to do our best. We're all trying to make the best decisions that we can. When people ask me, I can give advice, but I'm not living a perfect house. My house has plastic in it. I have a sofa I'm sure is full of flame retardants. I buy clothes from regular shops and
Mm.
stores. We're all just doing the
Yeah.
best that we can.
It's very hard as an individual to solve this problem. We really need it
Correct.
to be a whole societal thing led through regulatory and health policy, as you say. We can do our best as individuals, but we'd have to be fairly fanatic to be able to completely avoid these chemicals. And that's the reality, isn't it?
That's right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
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 So, what about what inspires you? Do you have a podcast or a film that's inspired you that you could recommend to our listeners?
So there are lots of great readings about endocrine disruptors, but I think that taking a step back and having this realization that what happens in our environment is affecting our health,
Mm,
I have a couple books that I would recommend.
yeah.
Have you read Radium Girls?
I haven't read it, but I've listened to a
Oh boy.
podcast on it.
By Kate Moore,
Yeah,
Radium Girls.
yeah.
If you pick
These
that
are the
up
girls
and
who
read
did the
just
watches, yeah?
it's about the
Yeah.
paint on watches
Yes.
and these women who ended up with really serious cancers and other
Mm,
health issues related to it. But because they were, doing this fine point painting. If you pick up that book and read the first 3 pages, the prologue, and you don't think this is something I need to read, I don't know what you're reading. It is a life-changing book.
wow.
And I'm always looking for books that are like that are
Mm,
based on real stories, but that are accessible to people who think, oh, this kind of science is not for me. I teach undergrads, right? And I,
mm,
I teach undergrads that are at every stage of their life and development, and some who know exactly what they're going to do when they grow up, and some who have no clue. And it's my job to get them to be inspired, to think about how the environment is affecting the health of people.
mm.
So I'm constantly collecting books that tell the stories, the real stories of people
Of the
that have
people.
been affected. And it is such a beautiful one.
Yeah.
And again, it's not breast cancer specific, but another great book is by Deborah Davis. And I don't know if you've interviewed Deborah before, but she is a world-class epidemiologist who's been studying um, environmental influences on cancer. And she wrote a book called The Secret History of the War on Cancer. And
Ooh,
my husband got it for me for Christmas a few years ago, and I was like, this is a weird book to buy for Christmas.
yeah.
And it is a great story of looking at environmental influences
Wow.
on
Oh,
cancer.
well, that's a great recommendation. Thank you very much for that. We will put all of your recommendations in the show notes, but also we will look into Deborah ourselves. Look, finally, what about your plans for the future? Do you have like a bucket list, things that you want to tick off that bucket list, or any plans that you want to share with us?
So, from a research perspective, my major bucket list is to continue to work to get regulatory agencies to use the mammary gland as
Mm,
an outcome that is relevant and should be used for protecting the public. I find it to be misogynistic that we don't do that, which is just one of those things that I've reached an age. I have no tolerance for that anymore.
yeah,
So.
I'm with you.
But also because breast cancer continues to affect an increasing number of
Mm,
women.
mm,
And the idea that we shouldn't worry about it because breast cancer is a disease of old women is simply not true. And if there's something that we can do to use the data that already exists to be able to better protect women from environmental pollutants that are contributing to breast cancer, this is my scientific mission for
brilliant.
the next 10 years is to try to make that happen.
Good on you, Laura. We need more people like you. It's utterly brilliant. And as I said earlier on, we were so pleased to have you as our keynote speaker. You are a true inspiration, and it's been a delight talking to you today. Where can people find out more about you?
Well, you can find me on LinkedIn,
Yeah.
but otherwise, you could see just a little bit about me in an HBO series called Not So Pretty.
Oh,
It's a 4-part series about personal care products, and I'm in one of the 4 episodes. I
brilliant.
think the third one.
Is that so? That
And
will
then
be
otherwise, I do
that will be
lots of
in Europe.
podcasts.
That. That'll be in Europe
I
as
don't
well,
know if
that
it's
HBO
available in
series?
Europe. It came out a few years ago, so we recorded it during the height of the pandemic.
Okay.
So it's now a couple years old, but still scientifically accurate.
Brilliant. Well, we'll include that in the notes, and any podcasts that you're on as well. Any that you recommend we listen to?
So I recently did a CNN podcast with Sanjay Gupta, which is really a broader picture look at environmental chemicals. So not breast cancer specific per se, but I mean I think that health focused podcasts, again, as you said, it can be really draining because it feels like, oh, they just keep telling me all the things that I'm doing wrong, right? And looking for ones that are really giving you accessible tips that fit in your life, I think are the ones that we need to seek out rather than the ones that are just telling us that we're doing it wrong. It just feels like
Yeah.
we're always doing it wrong.
That's absolute music to our ears, because that's exactly what we're about at Breast Cancer UK. It's about providing people options, giving them control over their health, obviously giving them the information they need to understand where the risks are. But ultimately, it has to be a positive message, doesn't it? And
Yes,
I think
yes.
on that note, we'll end this wonderful conversation. Thank you so much, Laura.
Thank you. Thank you for having me today.